Jake had always been proud of the life he had built on his family's land. It wasn't just property, it was history. His father had worked tirelessly to build the ranch, transforming it from a small plot of land into something the whole family could be proud of. Jake grew up there, learning the ropes of ranching from his father, and it became a place that was more than just home. It was where every part of his identity came from. The fields, the animals, the long days under the sun. It was all part of him, and he was determined to carry on his father's work. But life had a way of complicating things. When Jake was called away for a military deployment, he never imagined that it would lead to something so unexpected. His thoughts were always on the ranch, but he had to trust that everything was fine while he served his country. After all, his father had prepared him well, and he believed his land was secure. But as the days passed during his deployment, Jake received a call that would change everything. It was early one morning when the phone rang, a call he hadn't been expecting. He recognized the number as his lawyer, Frank Hamilton. Jake didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was a routine check-in. But when he answered, he could immediately sense that something was wrong. "Jake, we've got a problem." Frank's voice was tight with urgency. "The HOA, they've sold your land." Jake froze. The words barely registered in his mind at first. "What do you mean, sold my land?" he asked, confusion sweeping over him. "How? My land is mine. It's been in my family for generations." Frank let out a slow breath on the other end of the line. "I wish I were calling with good news, Jake. But the truth is, they've sold your property, and the deed is already transferred to new owners. They've taken control. I don't know how they did it, but the paperwork is all in order." Jake felt his heart race. This couldn't be true. There had to be some mistake. "I don't understand," Jake muttered. "How could they sell my land without my permission? I'm the rightful owner. My father, my family, has owned that land for generations." Frank's voice softened. "I know, Jake. I know. This doesn't make sense. But I've checked the documents, and the sale is legal on their end. It's a mess, and we need to figure out how this happened." Jake's mind spun as the weight of the situation hit him. The HOA, the very organization that was supposed to protect homeowners, had sold his family's property. Without his knowledge. Without his consent. Jake felt a hot rush of anger surge through him, and his hands clenched into fists. He had trusted the HOA to keep the community running smoothly, to protect his interests, and now it felt like they had betrayed him. How could they just do this? Jake asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "How is this even possible? I was away. Didn't they know I was serving my country? Why didn't they contact me?" "I don't know all the details yet, Jake," Frank replied, "but I can tell you this much. The HOA used a legal loophole. They claimed the property was abandoned because you were gone, and they moved forward with the sale. They acted quickly, and now the property has been transferred to new owners. We need to act fast." Jake didn't know how to respond. He felt the anger building up inside him, but at the same time, a sense of helplessness settled over him. His land, his family's land, was no longer his. He had trusted that everything would be waiting for him when he returned. But now, he was faced with a harsh reality. He had lost something that was irreplaceable. Who bought it? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet, Jake," Frank said. "I'm working on that, but the sale has already been finalized. The new owners may already be moving in. We'll figure this out, but we need to move fast." Jake's heart sank even further. The idea of someone else owning his father's land, of strangers walking around his property, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. But there was no time to waste. He needed to get home. He needed to fix this. "I'm coming back," Jake said, the decision coming quickly and decisively. "I'll leave right away. We'll deal with this when I get back. But I want to know everything. I want to know how they did this and how we can undo it." "I'll be in touch, Jake," Frank said. "But we need to have a plan. The longer this goes, the more difficult it will be to get the land back. It won't be easy, but we'll find a way." Jake hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, trying to process everything. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and determination. He had worked so hard for this land, and now it was gone. He had to get it back. There was no other option. This wasn't just about property, it was about his family's legacy, the land his father had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into. Jake couldn't let anyone take it from him. He couldn't let the HOA destroy what his father had worked so hard to build. He called his commanding officer to let him know what had happened and requested leave to return home. "I'm needed back home, sir," Jake said. "This is urgent, and I have to deal with it. I've been given the chance to fight for what's mine. I can't let this slide." "I understand, Jake," his commanding officer replied. "We'll make it happen. You've served us well, and now we'll support you. Get back as soon as you can." Jake packed up his things and boarded the next flight home, his mind racing with questions and strategies. He had no idea who the new owners were or what kind of trouble they might bring. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them take what was his without a fight. The flight felt endless. The minutes seemed to crawl by as Jake stared out the window, trying to sort through the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. The idea of someone else controlling his family's land made him sick. But Jake had been through tough situations before. He had been trained to push through adversity, to fight for what was right. And that was exactly what he planned to do. When Jake finally arrived home, he made his way straight to the ranch. It was early evening, and the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the land. As Jake pulled up to the ranch gate, he felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. This was the place where he had grown up, where his father had raised him to be a man. This land held memories. Memories of hard work, sacrifice, and love. And now, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. As he stepped out of his truck and looked around, Jake's determination grew. The land was still here, still his, and he wasn't going to let the HOA take it away without a fight. He had the strength to take on whatever came his way. And he would. The battle for his family's future had just begun. Jake's anger and disbelief festered in the days following his conversation with Frank. The news that the HOA had sold his land while he was overseas was still a bitter pill to swallow, and the more he thought about it, the more it felt like a betrayal not just of him, but of his entire family. The land had been passed down for generations, and now, just like that, it was no longer his. He wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers without a fight. After getting back from the airport, Jake didn't waste any time. He was determined to find out exactly how the HOA had managed to pull this off, and he needed answers. Answers that would help him get his land back. He knew that Frank, his lawyer, had already begun digging into the situation. But Jake wasn't the type to sit back and wait for someone else to solve the problem. He would take matters into his own hands. The first thing Jake did was go to the HOA office. Karen, the president, was the one who had sold his land, and Jake knew she was going to be the key to unraveling this mess. He walked into the office with purpose, ready to demand answers. As he entered, the familiar smell of coffee and the dull hum of the overhead lights filled the air. It looked just like he remembered, but now, it felt different. It was as though the place had lost its warmth, its purpose. Karen was sitting behind her desk, her back turned to Jake as she shuffled through some papers. He could see the back of her head as he approached, but she didn't acknowledge his presence. Her demeanor was cold, as always, like she was too busy for anyone's problems. "Karen," Jake said, his voice steady but sharp. "We need to talk." Karen didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. She slowly turned in her chair, a thin smile on her face. "Jake, I see you're back in town. What brings you by?" Her tone was casual, almost too casual, as if she hadn't just sold his family's property out from under him. "I want to know how you managed to sell my land," Jake said, his voice hardening. "My property was taken without my consent, and I'm not leaving here until I get answers." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her composure. "Jake, you know the HOA is responsible for managing properties in the community," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "You were gone for months. The land needed to be taken care of, and it's not unusual for the HOA to sell property that's been abandoned or neglected. Jake clenched his fists, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. It was never abandoned. It's been in my family for generations, and I've worked that land my whole life. You can't just take it and sell it without telling me. You had no right. Karen remained calm, her eyes focused on Jake. Jake, we followed the proper procedures, she said, her voice now carrying a hint of irritation. You were gone, and the HOA was well within its rights to act in the community's best interest. The property had to be sold to maintain the value of the neighborhood. Jake could barely contain his fury. You took advantage of my absence, Karen. You manipulated the system and sold my land behind my back. You can't just keep playing the victim here. The truth is, you've been using your position to profit off of people's land for years. Karen's face stiffened at the accusation, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. But she quickly regained her composure. Jake, you're making a big mistake. This is how business works. The HOA acts in the best interest of everyone in the community. You've been gone, and the land was sitting idle. It's not my fault things turned out this way. You're wrong, Karen, Jake said, his voice rising. You sold my land without telling me, without asking me, and now you're trying to cover it up. You're not getting away with this. Karen stood up slowly from behind her desk, her hands resting flat on the surface. I think it's time for you to leave, Jake, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We've done everything according to the rules. If you want to make this a bigger issue, go ahead. But you're not going to win. Jake didn't budge. We'll see about that, he said, turning to walk out of the office. His blood was boiling, but he knew he had to keep his cool. Karen was trying to intimidate him, but Jake wasn't going to back down. He had a bigger fight ahead, and he needed more information. As he stepped out of the office, his mind was already racing. His first priority was finding out who the new owners were. If he could track them down, he could find a way to reverse the sale. But Jake knew it wouldn't be that simple. The HOA had made this decision in secret, and whoever bought his land was likely not just going to hand it over. He needed leverage, and he needed it fast. The next morning, Jake went to the local courthouse to search for records of the sale. It was time to dig into the paperwork and see what he could find. He spent hours going through documents, sifting through the details of the transaction. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a copy of the deed transfer. His blood ran cold as he saw the name of the buyer. It wasn't just any buyer. It was a developer who had been buying up land all over the county. Jake knew this wasn't just about one property. This was about something bigger. The developer had a history of buying land, flipping it, and making huge profits, and now his family's land was part of that game. Jake's next move was clear. He needed to track down this developer and find out how much he knew about the sale and whether he was aware of the HOA's manipulation. But Jake wasn't going to go in blind. He reached out to Frank, his lawyer, to get his help in gathering more evidence. Together, they began building a case, reaching out to other homeowners who might have been affected by similar sales. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. The HOA wasn't just selling Jake's property. They had been involved in multiple shady deals, selling land to developers without the consent of the homeowners. It became clear that Karen had been taking advantage of her position for years, lining her pockets with money from these deals. The more Jake learned, the angrier he became. But now he had the tools to fight back. Frank made some calls, gathering witness testimonies and digging into Karen's connections with the developers. Slowly but surely, they were building a case that would expose the HOA for its corruption. Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to make them pay for what they had done. The truth was coming out, and Karen was about to face the consequences. The more Jake dug into the HOA's actions, the deeper he fell into a web of lies and manipulation. Every phone call, every conversation, every legal document he went through confirmed what he feared. Karen and the HOA had been using their position for years to exploit homeowners and make deals that benefited them at the expense of everyone else. It wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about a corrupt system that had taken control of the entire neighborhood. Jake knew that fighting the HOA alone was a losing battle. Frank was doing everything he could on the legal side, But Jake realized that he needed more than just paperwork and phone calls. He needed muscle. And he wasn't just talking about the legal muscle Frank could provide. No, Jake needed something bigger. He needed to call in the resources that would make Karen and the HOA take him seriously. The first step in his plan was calling a favor from his past, his military past. Jake had served with distinction, and over the years, he had built connections that could be crucial in this fight. The military had always been about loyalty and camaraderie, and Jake had never forgotten the people who had his back during the hardest times. He knew that Colonel Roberts, his former commanding officer, was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to help a fellow soldier, especially when it came to something as important as this. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number he knew by heart. The line clicked, and the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Jake, I didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on?" "Colonel, I need your help," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the situation. "I've got a problem, and it's bigger than anything I've faced before. The HOA sold my family's land without my consent while I was overseas. They've been using their power to push people around, and now they've taken what's mine." Colonel Roberts was silent for a moment, processing the information. "That doesn't sound right. The HOA should have no legal standing to take property like that, especially if you weren't given notice. What are you planning to do about it?" "I've been working with my lawyer, but we both know that's not enough," Jake said, his voice hardening with determination. "Karen, the HOA president, is too powerful. She's got influence over half the neighborhood, and I can't fight this alone. I need the military's support. I need the leverage to make them back down." "I see," the colonel said. "You're asking for more than just legal advice, Jake. You're asking for muscle. I can help you with that. We've got connections, Jake. We've got people who can help put pressure on them. The HOA might think they're untouchable, but they've never had to deal with someone like us." Jake felt a surge of relief wash over him. The military's support wasn't just about backing him. It was about making sure the HOA understood that they were dealing with someone who wouldn't back down, someone who had the resources to bring them to justice. "I appreciate it, Colonel. You've got no idea how much this means to me. But I need to act quickly. The new owners of my land have already started making plans to develop it, and I don't want to give them the chance to make irreversible changes." The colonel didn't hesitate. "I'll make a few calls, Jake. I'll put you in touch with some of our legal experts who specialize in this kind of thing. They'll help you navigate this. We've got friends in high places who can apply the pressure you need. We'll move fast, and I promise we'll make sure the HOA knows they've crossed a line." Jake's heart raced with anticipation. This was exactly what he needed. With the military's backing, he was no longer just a homeowner fighting against an unyielding bureaucracy. He had a powerful ally on his side, one that could turn the tide in his favor. "Thanks, Colonel. I won't let you down," Jake said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm coming for my land. And this time, they won't get away with it." The conversation ended, but Jake's mind was already moving ahead. He had the resources to make the HOA think twice. But there was still much to do. He couldn't wait for the system to fix it. He had to take control. It was time to put his plan into motion. Over the next few days, things started moving quickly. Jake was in constant contact with Colonel Roberts, and the military's resources began to work behind the scenes. The pressure they applied wasn't immediate, but it was enough to start rattling the HOA. Karen had always prided herself on being untouchable, but now, she was starting to feel the weight of the investigation that was closing in around her. Jake wasn't just waiting for the military to act, though. He was also making moves of his own. Frank had continued to dig into Karen's past, uncovering more about her shady dealings with developers, and Jake was determined to get to the bottom of it. One afternoon, Frank came to Jake with some shocking information. "Jake, I've got something you need to see," Frank said, pulling up a series of documents on his laptop. "I've been looking into the developers Karen has been dealing with. It looks like she's been profiting from these land deals for years, taking a cut on every property that gets sold. This wasn't just about your ranch, it's a much bigger scheme." Jake leaned forward, his anger rising once again. How much does she stand to gain from all this? Frank scrolled through the documents. She's been using the HOA as a cover for these deals. She's essentially been running her own side business, buying up properties, flipping them, and pocketing the profits. It's a pretty extensive operation, Jake. Jake clenched his fists. This is bigger than I thought. Karen's been using her position for years to line her pockets, and now she's trying to steal my family's land. With the truth in hand, Jake knew it was time to push harder. He made another call to the media, providing them with the evidence Frank had uncovered. It wasn't just about taking down Karen anymore. It was about exposing her for who she truly was. The corruption had to be exposed, and Jake was the one who was going to make sure of it. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on Karen and the HOA began to build. The media coverage was relentless, and the public began to take notice. The community that had once been afraid to speak out was now waking up. Jake wasn't just reclaiming his land. He was showing the entire neighborhood that standing up to the HOA was possible. With the military's backing, Frank's legal strategy, and the public support, Jake was well on his way to getting everything back. And Karen? She was feeling the walls close in. Jake was no longer just fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for the future of the community, and he was going to make sure Karen and the HOA paid for their actions. The more Jake delved into Karen's dealings, the clearer it became. This was far more than just a fight for his family's land. It was a battle against a deeply entrenched system of corruption that had been operating under the guise of community care for years. The HOA, the very organization that was supposed to protect homeowners, had become a front for Karen's personal financial gain. The realization hit Jake hard, but it also steeled his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for the entire community, for the future of every homeowner who had been taken advantage of by Karen's manipulative tactics. With Frank's help, Jake had uncovered enough evidence to make a solid case against Karen and the HOA. But they both knew that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. Karen had built an empire on controlling the neighborhood, and she wasn't going to give that up without a fight. Still, Jake was determined. He couldn't let her continue to exploit people, especially after what she had done to his family. They needed more. The documents they had gathered so far were powerful, but they still lacked one crucial piece: the full extent of Karen's involvement in the illegal sales. Jake knew that the truth was buried deep within the HOA's archives, hidden in the stacks of old paperwork and contracts. But Jake couldn't do this alone. He needed someone who could get them inside the HOA's records, someone who could crack open the vault of secrets Karen had worked so hard to keep hidden. That's when Frank had an idea. Jake, I have a contact who used to work for the HOA. Someone who's fed up with the way Karen's been running things. I think we can get the inside scoop we need. Jake agreed immediately. If they could find someone from within the HOA who was willing to testify against Karen, it would be the final piece they needed to bring her down. Frank made a few calls, and within days, they were meeting with a former HOA employee named Sarah. Sarah was hesitant at first. She had worked for the HOA for years, but once Karen took over, things changed. Sarah had seen firsthand how Karen manipulated the rules, how she lined her pockets by pushing through illegal land sales and making shady deals with developers. Sarah had tried to speak up, but Karen's grip on the HOA was tight, and she knew if she crossed Karen, she'd lose her job, and possibly more. It took some convincing, but eventually, Sarah agreed to help Jake and Frank. I've seen it all, Sarah said, her voice low, filled with frustration. Karen used to play by the book, but somewhere along the way, she started bending the rules. At first, it was just a few small things, nothing anyone would notice. But then it escalated. She started taking advantage of homeowners who were either too busy or too scared to notice. And that's when the land deals began. Sarah went on to explain how Karen had been secretly selling off land to developers, often without homeowners' knowledge. She had used her power as HOA president to bypass property owners and seize land under the pretense of improving the community. But the truth was, Karen was pocketing the profits from these deals, and she had been doing it for years. If someone questioned her, she'd shut them down, or worse, threaten them with fines and legal action, Sarah continued. She made sure people were too afraid to speak out. Jake was seething with anger as he listened. It wasn't just his land that had been taken. It was the land of every homeowner who had ever lived under Karen's rule. The damage was far-reaching, and Karen's manipulation had affected more people than Jake could have ever imagined. But now, with Sarah's inside knowledge, they had the evidence they needed to take her down. Sarah handed Jake a stack of documents, each one a piece of the puzzle. These were the records of Karen's deals, the forged signatures, the falsified documents, and the hidden transactions. This is just a small part of what she's done, Sarah said, looking at Jake with determination. But with these, you can expose her for what she really is. Jake felt a rush of adrenaline. He had the truth now, and with Sarah's help, they were going to make sure everyone knew what Karen had been doing. This is the start, Jake said, his voice full of conviction. We're going to take her down, and we're going to make sure no one else gets hurt by her greed. As Jake and Frank began to compile the evidence, they knew they needed to make their next move. It wasn't enough to just have the documents. Now, they had to take them public. The community needed to see the truth, and Jake knew that once people realized how long Karen had been exploiting them, they would rally behind him. The tide was turning, and Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping. Jake didn't wait long. He contacted a local journalist who had been covering some of the recent corruption scandals in the area. The reporter was eager to take on the story, and soon, the first article began to take shape. Jake made sure the story was packed with details, the forged signatures, the illegal sales, and the shady developers who had profited from Karen's actions. It was time to shine a light on everything Karen had tried to keep hidden. The article was published the next day. As soon as it hit the newsstands, Jake's phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had been affected by the HOA's actions started reaching out. People who had been silent for so long were finally speaking out, sharing their stories, and showing their support for Jake. The truth was out, and Karen couldn't hide from it anymore. But Karen didn't go down without a fight. The moment the article was released, she called an emergency HOA meeting. She tried to rally the community, painting herself as a victim of Jake's false accusations. She claimed that everything had been done legally and that Jake was simply trying to destroy the HOA's reputation. But the community wasn't buying it. The evidence was too strong, and the media coverage had already turned public opinion against her. Jake knew this was the beginning of the end for Karen. She had been exposed, and now, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The community had woken up, and they weren't going to let her get away with it anymore. As Jake stood at the edge of his family's ranch, looking out over the land that he had worked so hard to protect, he knew the battle was far from over. The fight for justice had just begun, and he wasn't going to stop until Karen and the HOA were held accountable for everything they had done. He wasn't just reclaiming his land, he was reclaiming the future of the entire community. With the truth exposed and the evidence in hand, Jake knew the next step was crucial. It was no longer enough to simply collect documents and testimonies. Now, he had to take the fight to the people. The community had been living under Karen's thumb for far too long, and now that the truth had been revealed, it was time for them to take a stand. Jake couldn't do it alone. The HOA had held too much power for too long, but the community was starting to see the truth. They needed to act. Jake met with Frank, his lawyer, and together, they devised a plan to put maximum pressure on Karen and the HOA. Frank had already made connections with reporters, and now it was time to use the media to their advantage. The local newspaper had already run the initial story, but Jake knew they needed to push it further. This wasn't just about one man getting his land back. This was about exposing a system of corruption that had affected every homeowner in the neighborhood. The article was a good start, but Jake needed more. He needed the entire community to know what had been going on behind closed doors for years. Jake contacted the local news station, and within hours, a camera crew arrived at his ranch to film an interview. The reporter was a seasoned journalist who had been following the corruption stories in the area for some time, and he was eager to get the full story. Jake was nervous. This was a big moment, and he couldn't afford to mess it up. But as the camera rolled, Jake found his voice. People think that the HOA is there to protect homeowners, To ensure that we live in a fair and safe community, Jake said, his voice steady as he spoke directly to the camera. But what the HOA did to me, what they've done to so many people in this neighborhood, is not just wrong, it's criminal. They've taken land from people who worked hard for it, and they've done it under the radar, using their power to manipulate and control. I'm not just fighting for my land. I'm fighting for everyone who has been taken advantage of by Karen and the HOA. This ends now. Jake paused for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. He could feel the power of his message. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the entire community waking up to the truth. The interview aired that evening, and the reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out started coming forward, sharing their own experiences with the HOA. People who had been intimidated by Karen's threats and her control over the community were now speaking out, emboldened by Jake's bravery. The story quickly spread, and within days, Jake's phone was flooded with messages from people who were willing to support him in any way they could. The pressure on Karen and the HOA grew with each passing hour. Karen, who had once been so confident, now found herself scrambling. She tried to downplay the story, claiming that Jake was simply stirring up trouble. She tried to deflect, blaming the whole situation on paperwork errors and misunderstandings. But the public wasn't buying it. The evidence was out there, and the community was starting to demand answers. Jake wasn't just sitting back and waiting for the legal system to do its work. He knew that Karen's control over the HOA wasn't going to disappear overnight. She still had influence, and she would do everything she could to hold on to it. Jake knew that he had to hit her where it hurt the most. He needed to make sure that the public knew who she truly was. With Frank's help, Jake began working on a new strategy. It wasn't just about reclaiming his land anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable for everything she had done. The press was on their side now, and they had the community's support. It was time to take the fight to the HOA's doorstep. Jake and Frank organized a community meeting at the local town hall. The room was packed. Homeowners, reporters, even people who had once been too intimidated to speak out. Jake took the stage, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of the neighborhood. "Thank you all for coming," Jake began, his voice calm but firm. "We're here today because Karen and the HOA have been abusing their power for too long. They've been selling property, taking advantage of homeowners, and lining their own pockets. It's time for us to stand up and demand justice. I know some of you have been afraid to speak out, but you don't have to be afraid anymore. We have the truth on our side. Together, we can make sure that Karen and the HOA can never do this to anyone again." The room erupted into applause. The energy was electric, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like the community was on his side. People stood up one by one, telling their own stories about how the HOA had wronged them. Some shared how Karen had threatened them with fines. Others talked about how their properties had been sold without their knowledge. Each story added fuel to the fire, and the room became a chorus of voices demanding change. Karen wasn't going to let this meeting slide. She had been watching from the back of the room, her arms crossed and her face red with anger. As the crowd continued to speak out, Karen stood up and tried to take control of the meeting. "This is nonsense," she shouted, her voice cutting through the crowd. "I've done nothing wrong. You all know that the HOA has always had the best interests of the community at heart." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The truth had come out, and they weren't going to let her get away with it. People started shouting at her, calling her out for the corruption and greed that had been hidden for years. For the first time, Karen was being held accountable for her actions. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. Jake stood there, watching the chaos unfold. It felt good to see the community finally take a stand. The tide was turning, and Jake wasn't going to stop until Karen and the HOA were brought to justice. The fight for his land wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done to his neighbors, to his friends, and to his community. The media coverage grew even more intense after the meeting. Reports on the corruption within the HOA started appearing in the local and national news. People from other neighborhoods started reaching out to Jake, telling him that they had similar stories of HOA abuse. It was clear that Karen's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. Jake had ignited a movement, and now it was growing beyond anything he had imagined. But Jake knew the real battle was still ahead. Karen would not go down easily. She would fight tooth and nail to maintain her power. But Jake had something she didn't. He had the truth, the community, and a relentless drive to make sure the corruption was exposed for all to see. The fight wasn't over yet, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake had done everything by the book, gathering evidence, gaining community support, and exposing Karen's corruption to the public. But as much as the truth had been revealed, he knew that Karen wasn't going to just sit back and accept defeat. She had spent years building her power, and now, she was desperate to hold on to it. This was going to be the final showdown, the moment when everything would be decided. Jake wasn't naive. He knew that this battle wasn't over just because people knew the truth. Karen had too much pride, and too much at stake, to let the community take back control without a fight. She would try to manipulate the situation, twist the narrative, and find any way she could to get back on top. But Jake wasn't scared. He had seen the worst, fought on the front lines, and never backed down. This fight was no different. The final legal proceedings were fast approaching, and Jake knew the clock was ticking. His lawyer, Frank, had made sure they had all their ducks in a row. The evidence was solid. There was no way Karen could deny the illegal sale of Jake's land and the manipulation she had used to steal from so many homeowners. But Jake also knew that Karen's power wasn't just in the HOA. It was in the fear she had instilled in the people around her. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative any longer. It all came to a head when the day of the court hearing finally arrived. Jake stood outside the courthouse, the sun beating down on him as his mind raced. This was it. He had fought for months. He had faced Karen's intimidation, and he had exposed her lies. He was standing at the threshold of victory, but he knew that Karen would pull out all the stops to try to save herself. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about justice. Inside the courthouse, the tension was thick. Jake could feel the weight of everyone's expectations on his shoulders. His neighbors, the reporters, and even a few local politicians who had been following the story were all in the courtroom, waiting for the decision. On the other side, Karen and her team of lawyers were seated at the front, their faces tense with determination. Karen, however, had a look of quiet confidence in her eyes, as though she truly believed that she could talk her way out of this one. The trial began, and Frank stood up to present their case. He outlined the facts clearly. The HOA had sold Jake's land without his permission, using a loophole in the system, and the deal had been made with the new owners under false pretenses. Frank laid out the evidence, presenting the forged documents, the emails, and the witness statements that all pointed to Karen's role in the illegal transaction. The case against her was airtight. Jake watched Karen's face as Frank spoke. Her confidence began to slip as the weight of the evidence mounted against her. Jake could see her stiffening in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. It was clear that Karen wasn't used to losing control, and it was even more apparent that she wasn't prepared for the truth to come crashing down on her. Then, it was Karen's turn to speak. She stood up slowly, her face flushed with anger. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to keep her composure. "I acted in the best interests of the community. I didn't steal anything. I was simply making sure that the land was taken care of while Jake was away on military duty." Her words were met with a few murmurs of disbelief from the courtroom. Jake could feel the eyes of the community on her, and he knew she was losing her grip. But Karen wasn't done. She tried to paint herself as the victim, portraying Jake as an ungrateful landowner who had never really cared about the property or the community. She called his military service into question, suggesting that he was too distracted to manage his land properly. But the more Karen spoke, the more her credibility crumbled. The community had seen through her lies. They knew what she was really after. She had used her position to manipulate people, to steal from them, and to enrich herself at the expense of the homeowners she was supposed to serve. Her desperate attempt to turn the tables only made her look worse. Jake stood up, feeling the energy of the room shift in his favor. He wasn't going to let Karen spin her lies any longer. He had already lost so much: his family's land, his sense of security, and his trust in the people who were supposed to protect the community. But now, he had a chance to make things right. "Your Honor," Jake began, his voice strong and unwavering. "I didn't ask to be put in this position. I didn't ask for the HOA to take my land. But I'm standing here today because I believe in what's right. I believe in the truth. And I believe that no one should ever have to go through what I've been through because of greed and corruption." Jake turned to Karen, his eyes locking with hers. "You've taken enough from me and from the people in this community. You've lied, you've manipulated, and you've stolen. But today, it stops. I'm here to take back what's mine, and to make sure you never hurt anyone again." The room was silent as Jake's words sank in. He could feel the weight of the moment, the years of frustration, the pain of losing his family's land, and the resolve to fight for what was right. He had exposed the truth, and now the community was with him. The judge didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence to hang in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "After carefully considering the evidence presented, I find that the HOA's actions were not only unethical but illegal. The sale of Mr. Jake's property is hereby reversed, and the HOA is ordered to pay restitution for damages caused by their unlawful actions. Additionally, any and all dealings with the new property owners will be null and void." Jake's heart leapt as the judge's words hit him. The victory was finally his. He had won. The land was his again, and Karen's reign of terror had come to an end. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the official decision, Jake couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. But Jake wasn't just celebrating a personal victory. He was celebrating the fact that the community had been freed from the clutches of Karen and the HOA. He had exposed her for what she truly was, a corrupt leader who used fear and intimidation to control people. Karen sat in stunned silence as the weight of the decision sank in. Her empire had crumbled, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jake turned to Frank, who gave him a proud smile. The fight had been long, and it had been hard, but they had won. Jake walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. The land was his again, and he had finally gotten the justice he deserved. The HOA had tried to take everything from him, but Jake had taken it all back. And with the truth on his side, there was no force strong enough to take his future away.